name is Millie Mumford, and I am the director and host of a new web series called Nerds4Earth. Here at Nerds4Earth, we want to highlight local scientists, innovators, and knowledge keepers who are fighting climate change and protecting our planet. This is our first episode. And because it's our first episode, we want to talk about what's important right here, right now, in the middle of 2020. We cannot address climate change and our environmental crisis without also addressing the crisis of systemic racism and social and economic inequality. The issues of climate change, colonialism, and racial injustice are deeply entwined, especially here on Turtle Island, or North America. So we wanted to pass the mic to some superheroes who are working in both social justice and sustainability to show just how connected these issues are.
Now, to get us started, let's introduce our episode superheroes.
Hi folks, my name is Adriana Laurent and I am working at the UBC Climate Hub right now. I'm a mixed race, Black queer, climate justice activist, and I'm originally from Honduras in Central America.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me on this episode of Nerds4Earth. My name is Udokam Iregbu. I am an activist with Black Lives Matter Vancouver. I am a consultant with Cicely Blaine Consulting, which is a diversity and inclusion consulting firm. And I also work for transportation design at the City of Vancouver. I'm very honored to be here today, and thank you for allowing me to speak to this, given the work that I do.
My name is Patrick, and I am a Haida filmmaker and social innovator from Haida Gwaii. And the work that I do is mostly around how do we use technology and media to create more opportunities and elevate marginalized voices that typically haven't had the opportunity to be heard. And so most of my work centers around cultural revitalization and youth empowerment.
I'm Andrea Anduello, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. My academic background is in planning, and my current research interests are focused on issues of equity and justice related to processes of change related to sustainability, resilience, and climate change. And of course, how we shift towards a more sustainable and just future.
The first question that we asked our experts was, how are climate change and colonialism linked? And what are your experiences with this in the work that you do?
So in the work that I do, we definitely unpack the legacy and the ongoing oppression as a result of colonization. And it is actually impossible to look at any anything that we're unpacking in this moment, or any human issue that we're looking at this moment, and not trace it back to colonization.
The way I see it, colonialism is inextricably linked with resource extraction and capitalism, which in turn have accelerated the climate crisis.
Climate change and racial injustice really go hand in hand. When you look at what has gotten us to this point in our society, we have created a society that doesn't value people. It doesn't value culture. It doesn't value a pristine place to live, because you can't put a monetary value on that. It's invaluable. And when you have a system that doesn't care about people, it's the people who typically have less resources that are the ones that really feel the brunt of the impacts caused by industry, caused by colonialism.
If we're talking about transitioning to a more sustainable and just future, particularly within the Canadian context or any settler nation context, these processes are intrinsically linked to our past, and our past includes relationships with Indigenous peoples, knowledge, and territories. In my own research, my colleagues and I have found that when it comes to environmental policy, there is a lack of proper representation of Indigenous peoples and knowledge.
So if we look at colonialism and we look at the ways that it was used to extract resources violently from land, and the ways that it was used to displace and like hold people as property in forced labor, we can see that fueling capitalism, and we can now see that climate change as a result of our industrial processes followed by our agricultural processes, so deforestation and all that stuff. And if you look to see the history of the industrial complex, you know that it's embedded in the colonial practices, and actually the only way that we have what we have now is as a result of the colonial practices of extracting resources, land, and people.
We're continuously exploiting our resources, and we're continuing exploiting the land, and we're continuously also exploiting the people who live on it, both on a local and a global level. And this is justified through a really long history of environmental racism that targets Black, Indigenous, and communities of color specifically. And I think that in order to address the climate crisis, we must address the root causes that have caused the problem. And we have to hold governments and corporations accountable for the damages they've done both in the past and in the present. And these damages would account for both the planet and the people as well.
We also asked, how are climate change and racial injustice linked?
So we know and have known for some time that vulnerable people from lower socioeconomic and racialized backgrounds are more negatively affected by environmental outcomes.
So when you unpack the reasons why we're facing a very serious climate crisis right now, you look at colonization. Well, when you look at colonization, you have to also look at the impact of that and who was impacted by that. And you can now see racial injustice.
I think we need to understand that racial justice is climate justice. Climate change will disproportionately impact, and has already disproportionately impacted, the most marginalized communities all over the world. I've on a personal level have already experienced the devastating impacts of climate change back home in Honduras. And communities in the global south have been feeling these impacts for years now.
Climate change is affecting marginalized people more than anyone else. You know, I see it back in my home with the water levels rising, and I see it all along Highway 16 up in northern BC, where resource extraction has divided communities, has priced out specifically Indigenous communities that aren't as high income. And so you look at this ever marching progress that the government likes to call it. But who is it progress for? It's definitely not progress for Indigenous people, marginalized voices. It's definitely not progress for the environment.
At the center of every kind of human threat, you find people that have been placed at the margins. And so we're looking at the current pandemic, for example, you find that it is disproportionately affecting brown and black bodies. You look at people that are currently facing lack of clean drinking water, and you see that those are our indigenous community and our black communities. You look at folks that are on the front lines and doing frontline work, and you also see that those are racialized people and people of color. So when we look into climate change, we find that the least contributors, being people that are placed at society's margins, being people that are marginalized for either their race, their income, social status, education, and gender and sexual identities, they're the ones that are hugely impacted, even while being the smallest contributors to our climate change.
Environmental justice is both a field of research but also a call to action. It began as an offshoot of the U.S. civil rights movements and grassroots responses to pollution in racialized communities, as well as fighting against corrupt businesses, discriminatory zoning, and biased decision-making and unequal law enforcement.
We can see the connection between climate change and racial justice in both the cause of climate change, which I explained before, but also in the impacts of climate change. The way I see it, it's an intersectional social justice issue, and white supremacy and colonialism are at the very core of the problem, and that's something we absolutely need to address. Our solutions need to address these root causes.
Given that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused many facets of life to be interrupted, how would you like your field to be changed post-COVID-19? How do you already see it changing?
Now, I'm going to speak specifically for the work that I do at the City of Vancouver. I would like to see us take a race-forward approach and address racial injustice in the work that we do. So we will find that a lot of folks don't identify that anti-racism fits at every job, and activism should have a seat at every table. And so if you're not taking an anti-racist approach, if you're not addressing anti-blackness, if you're not addressing racial justice in the work that you're doing, you are actually leaving out an opportunity to address the root causes of some of the issues that we're facing today, and also to address the people that are most impacted by some of the issues that we're facing today environmentally.
Climate justice is often used as a term to frame global warming as an ethical and political issue rather than just an environmental one. The primary focus is on assisting or finding ways to help those affected by the impacts of climate change, particularly those already in vulnerable positions. Climate justice encourages us to think about environmental and social impacts from both the local and international scale. We need to be asking ourselves, how are our actions and decisions, or those made by our governments, affecting our neighbors, as well as people thousands of miles away? From the perspective of an educator, I strive to give my students the skills and questions to be critical of what's happening, so they can become more equitable environmental managers and policymakers.
A lot of my work involves around media and technology and the adoption of that, especially in more remote communities that typically don't have as much access to that. And through this global pandemic that's been going on, it's been opening up a lot of people's eyes to utilizing the internet in particular in ways that they may have never thought of using it before, from education to mobilizing. And what I would love to see more of, and which I'm definitely seeing the trajectory of, is being able to make sure that voices that don't often get the opportunity to be heard are getting those opportunities, that they're being sought out, that now there is an effort being made to make sure that voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard are now getting opportunity to be heard. And I think what that's doing now is bringing to light a lot of the inequalities that have been raging in many marginalized communities and remote communities, and now everyone's kind of on a level playing field. And because of that, there is more investment being done in infrastructure, in internet, in providing services. And when I look at especially arts organizations or any other organizations, they're now seeing remote communities as an option now, as opposed to, oh, it's too far away, we can't send someone out there, it would be too costly. Now everyone is the same. And so now you can include someone from a remote community, you can include more Indigenous peoples, you can include more people of color in the discussion, in the activities, in the platforms, to be able to start getting more grassroots movements happening. COVID has exposed a lot of the inequalities that we've had, even as people who are trying to create progressive social change and cultural and climate action. We ourselves have been ignoring groups, and COVID has now exposed that a lot more, but also reminded us that more people need to be involved in the conversation, and we're getting used to utilizing technology to include people in those conversations. So I think that is something that needs to move forward. I think that's how my work needs to change, is being able to do stuff more remotely. It doesn't always have to be that privileged person flying into an Indigenous community to be able to help and bring up those voices.
So I've heard a lot of folks refer to both COVID-19 and climate change as the great equalizers, claiming that both these emergencies will bring balance to an unequal world. I fundamentally disagree with that, and I would instead say that both COVID-19 and climate change have highlighted how inequality and racism are so deeply embedded in our society and all of our institutions. And this is something that racialized communities have been talking about for years now, for a very, very long time. That being said, though, we've also seen that radical and transformational change is possible. And what I'd like to see for climate action moving forward is to understand that we absolutely need to center justice. We need to center justice in our work, both in the process, but also in the outcome. It all needs to be grounded in justice and community.
How else do you think we can strive for a just recovery from the pandemic? That is, using our recovery to work on environmental concerns, racial justice, and other human rights concerns.
I think a just recovery is one that understands that A, we can't go back to normal that was so damaging to so many people, but instead we need to create a new normal. B, the understanding that our work in the present must take an intersectional approach that moves us all towards an equitable and resilient society. C, I think we need to center community and the lived experience of marginalized voices. And finally, D, I think we need empathetic leadership in order to achieve this.
Listen to racialized people. Believe their lived experience. Read their materials. I feel like that is the only way that we can have a just recovery, is if we center the lives and lived experience of racialized people, if we center the lives and lived experience of our Indigenous communities, if we center the lives and lived experience of Black people. Right now, yes, we are in the middle of a pandemic, but we're also in the middle of one of the biggest uprisings of our lifetime. And we can't just move forward business as usual. You see companies coming out with statements saying Black Lives Matter. You see companies coming out with statements committing to anti-racism work. And that's the only way we can move forward. If we can't call these things out for what they are, if we can't actually address and unpack colonial legacy and approach the work that we do with an anti-colonial mindset, then we're actually not going to make any shifts. We're just going to replicate the same process. So if we do want to actually create change, and if we do want to have a just recovery, if we do want to actually address the impact of climate change, we do have to start centering the lived experience of communities that have been oppressed, communities that have been placed at the margins of society. And when you go looking into this, you will find that it is unfortunately our Indigenous communities, unfortunately our Black communities as well.
With this global pandemic exposing the cracks, exposing the injustices and inequalities within our society, we're going to start seeing a greater appetite now that people have had no choice but to actually pay attention. And I think any moral and just society would have to start addressing these inequalities. We can't just go back to how things were. Otherwise, that's a willful ignorance. That is something that is just deplorable. And so when it comes to environmental concerns, when it comes to racial justice, or even human rights concerns, I think it's important that as we move forward, as we try and rebuild these industries, these communities, these places of work, that we do it with this new exposure for a lot of people who have never even thought about these injustices before. Now it needs to be at the forefront of minds as we move forward. And those people making the decisions need to start factoring that into everything, because a big part, especially about being a progressive organization or an ally, is making sure that space is being held and not being taken over by people who typically have the privilege and have never had those barriers put in place. As we move forward, we need to make sure that space is being held for people who typically and historically have never been able to occupy that space in a meaningful way.
We are witnessing a huge shift in public discourse right now on the topics of race, justice, and anti-Blackness. And I think that radical change is both possible and absolutely necessary.
This year and this pandemic have given us all the opportunity to pause and reflect about how we want to move forward in a changed world. And there are so many ways that people have been trying to move forward already for a long time. It's going to be easiest to save our Earth if we're trying to make it a better place to live for everyone. And that's why we have to help out those who need it most right now. Thanks for watching. This was our first show of Nerds4Earth.